About 20 years ago, a senior pastor says young men told him they had been abused by Paul Cain, who went to Mike Bickle's Kansas City church and IHOP. I told the leadership, he said, that it was required by law to report this to the authorities if there was even a remote possibility that a victim could have been underage. In one specific case of a youth abused, I informed them that this person had all the classic signs present before a mental breakdown. I told them that it was fine to pray for Paul, but what about the victims? This pastor said he told IHOP leaders, but they told him not to report it to anyone. In 2023, Paul Cain is no longer alive, but we are hearing about allegations of clergy sexual abuse by another preacher at IHOP, Mike Bickle. We are also hearing claims there is a cover-up going on to prevent a proper investigation of him. The latest evidence to support the claims is audio recordings. Many people in fact recently heard the audio recordings of a whistleblower who recorded a conversation with a person at the highest levels of the executive leadership, David Slyker. Blaze Fort, a former IHOP-KC leader and current YouTube star, uploaded the recordings onto the internet. He also provided a link to the transcript, a PDF file. He discussed the subject with his wife Christina for an hour on his podcast, Wake Up and Win. But what a lot of people have not heard are the secret audio recordings of Stuart Greaves. The Slyker audio files are damning in more than one way, revealing what the leadership knew and when they knew it. The podcasters believe it exposes the leadership for lying to the public about Bickle. The Greaves audio tape also exposes Greaves for lying, and is also damning, but for a different reason, which is potentially much more serious. The Greaves recording was not at a secret private meeting behind closed doors. It is an IHOP-KC abuse survivor confronting Greaves out in the open at a public meeting at IHOP-KC. The survivor's name is Gracia, and she flew in from out of state just to confront Greaves and tell him to his face what he did was wrong. What did Greaves do wrong? While she was at IHOP-KC, Gracia was raped. Greaves was informed and told her not to tell the police. She didn't report it, so you might think, well, if she didn't tell them, Greaves is off the hook. Pastor Richard Moore recently said on his podcast, "Churchpreneurs, pastors and leaders must report sex crimes. It is to protect the survivors, who can become too traumatized to report the crime. Leaders should know this," he said. He seemed to be suggesting that there are legal requirements on leaders. In some states it goes beyond an ethical obligation to a legal requirement, making it illegal for a leader not to report a sex crime brought to his attention. Let's listen to what Pastor Richard Moore said on his podcast.
All pastors, to my knowledge, all ministers are mandated reporters. That means if they get any wind of sexual abuse, sexual improprieties of a criminal nature specifically, that they are mandated to report their physical abuse as well, say a child abuse, abuse in a home, a woman being abused, someone being abused in some way or another, that you understand rises to the level of criminal behavior. You as a pastor are mandated to report it.
In this case, the legal requirement to put Greaves in legal jeopardy is based on the question of what he knew and when he knew it. Did he know about the rape? In the secretly recorded audio, Greaves admits that he knew Gracia had been raped. What he says is that he advised Gracia to report the crime to the police. That is an admission, on tape, to meet the first legal requirement of knowledge. He knew. At the same time of this striking admission of his personal knowledge of the sex crime against a girl he had a spiritual responsibility to protect, Greaves also meets the second requirement to have not reported the crime. He admits he didn't report it because when Gracia accuses him of telling her to not report it, he doesn't say he reported it, which he obviously would have done if he had. Stuart Greaves may want to hire a criminal defense attorney. He needs to know if he committed a crime by not reporting the sex crime at IHOP while he was a leader. He has been there for 20 years, including the time, about 10 years ago, when the crime was committed.
Gracia's confrontation was with Stuart Greaves. He was once the overseer of the prayer room's night watch. This was back in Gracia's day, and back then, he was one of the people that handled her rape claim. But today, Stuart Greaves is a primary leader at IHOP and leads the entire executive leadership team.
There are already 2 witnesses who have corroborated Gracia's claim that Greaves told her not to report the crime to the police. There are now 3 people saying Greaves lied and is trying to cover up his refusal to report the crime. It now looks like 2 crimes were committed at IHOP, 1 the sex crime, and 2, the cover-up. Let's listen to what Gracia said on the Heaven Bent podcast.
After the interaction that I had with him, I immediately started doubting my own memory because of how insistent he was that he told me to call the police. I refused to call the police. And I was thinking, you know what, maybe there was a time that I'm just forgetting in all those meetings where he did tell me to call the police. And so I actually asked 2 other people, one of which was in the meeting, one of which knew about all the meetings as they were happening and kind of got the minutes of it. I asked the person that was in the meeting, what do you remember? Do you remember if he told me to go to the police? And do you remember how I reacted to that? Does this sound familiar to you? And if this person is still at IHOP, they're still connected. They have no reason to say anything that defends me at this point. And they immediately were like, no, they discouraged you to go to the police. And here was their reasoning why they discouraged you to go to the police. I remember that clearly. And then when I asked the person who got the minutes of things kind of as they happened back then, without them talking to each other, they directly corroborated stories. Both of them said the same thing and the same reasonings for it too. So I was like, okay, no, this isn't in my head. I'm not forgetting him telling me this. Other people that were there remember the same thing a decade later.
It is beyond inappropriate for Stuart Greaves to be involved in the leadership at IHOP to lead the investigation of sex crimes by Mike Bickle, and his attempts to cover them up, when he himself has been credibly accused of covering up a sex crime. If Greaves covered up a sex crime by someone at IHOP who was not a leader, how do we know he didn't also cover up sex crimes by its top leader Mike Bickle? Stuart Greaves not only should recuse himself or be removed from any involvement in the investigation of Mike Bickle, but a separate and new investigation should be launched of Stuart Greaves for covering up a sex crime.